Okay, let me get started. So thanks a lot for joining, and thanks for organizers for including this paper in the program. So this is joint work with Shannon Manrana and Sandeep Suktankar, both at UVA. And in this paper, we want to think about corruption as an informal fiscal system. So we all know that building and investing in state capacity is essential for structural transformation and economic growth to translate in inclusive growth. And there's also plenty of evidence that developing countries often fail to both invest in fiscal capacity and also face persistent corruption. So in this paper, we want to propose a new explanation for this joint persistence of these two patterns. And our premise is that corruption can substitute for formal fiscal policies via what we call informal fiscal systems. So what's an informal fiscal system? It's a situation in which central governments do not provide sufficient funds for local officials to do their jobs and to provide public services. And instead, local officials rely on bribes and rents that they extract from citizens in order to provide these public services. This is not something that's officially sanctioned by governments, but that is implicitly permitted in order to bridge any funding gaps. It's also different from the form of informal taxation that's been analyzed in the literature, in the sense that the source of funds is bribes and is potentially extracted from completely unrelated services, and as a result is not provided voluntarily by citizens. So what we do in the paper is we first used survey data and reports to document the existence of these systems in India and in Pakistan. And in the second part of the paper, we propose a model to try to understand the causes and the consequences of such systems. So let me start with the empirical part. The first situation we look at is the case of police stations in India. Here we've got data on 180 police stations. And what the exercise we do is to compare the budget that they receive for petrol to the budget that's required to carry out the patrols that we know they're doing. And here we find a significant funding gap of around 15,000 rupees per month per station, which corresponds to about $200 US. And this is actually pretty significant in comparison to the salary that these police officers receive. So the question is, where is this money coming from? This is a large amount compared to the salary of these officers, and they don't receive money from the government from doing it. So we know this is an area with a lot of corruption taking place, and also reports indicate that officers are expected to find other means to finance it. Our second environment we look at with a bit more data is the case of local officials in Pakistan. Here what we've got is a survey on 750 bureaucrats. What we find out from them is that a large portion report personally funding public goods out of their own pocket. So they provide these goods without it being an official part of their job description, including things like providing flood control or relief for after floods, as well as providing free food to the public via food banks. Why would they do that? Well, when we asked them, they stated that the main reason was that they're expected to do that by their peers. There's a norm, but this is what they're supposed to do and face pressure to do that. It's not just them saying that. We also have a separate survey that we conducted with their supervisors. Supervisors indicate that they can actually face disciplinary actions if this task are not executed. All of our respondents indicated that when they pay for these services, some of the funds come from their own pockets. And the amount they fund contributes to between 13 to 80% of the total funding. Again, this isn't just the bureaucrats saying that to make themselves look good. It's actually been confirmed by almost all of their supervisors that we contacted. So the question again here, where do these funds come from? We know that it cannot all be covered by their own income, because when we compare the income that they report spending on it and the cost of providing these services, there's still a funding gap. We also know that citizens who interact with these bureaucrats very often have to pay bribes to access services. And finally, the supervisors themselves say that the government does not provide these funds exactly because it knows that the bureaucrats obtain bribes. So why would a government ever do that? So this is where we turn to the theory section. we have a model of a bureaucratic agency with a politician and a bureaucrat. The politician chooses a level of formal taxation and an amount to invest in corruption monitoring in order to maximize the utility of some selected important group of citizens. The bureaucrat is in charge of delivering the public services. They choose how much bribe to collect and how much of these bribes to redistribute into the public services. The bureaucrats value the provision of these public services, especially when it's observable, in line with what our respondents told us is the reason why they provide these public services. But they also value keeping some of the bribes for themselves, and so they trade off the optimal amount to collect and to redistribute. What we find is that in equilibrium, there's two possible policies: a formal fiscal policy in which there's no bureaucrat funding and all the funding is from official formal taxes, and an informal fiscal policy in which part of the funding is coming from the bureaucrats themselves and the official taxes are lower than in a formal system. The informal fiscal system is more likely to be chosen by the government if public service delivery is easier to monitor than corruption. This is what we show, and the intuition behind it is that if it's easier to monitor public service delivery, it's easier to incentivize the bureaucrat to redistribute the bribes that they obtain rather than to prevent them from obtaining the bribes in the first place. So why do we think it's important to understand these fiscal systems and to study them in more depth? We already know from the literature that these developing countries often fail to invest in fiscal capacity, and here we suggest a new rationale for why governments lack incentives to make this investment in fiscal capacity and this transformation. We also know from the informal taxation literature that there are such goods that are provided informally, but what we uncover here is a broader system in which the government relies on the incentives of bureaucrats to both collect the taxes and redistribute them, and so this is going to have different welfare implications. And finally, because the funds are coming from bribes and corruption, this also suggests a new reason why corruption can persist and governments have less incentives to invest in monitoring corruption. And this is related to the incentives of bureaucrats and also to the observability of public service delivery and to fiscal system. So I'm going to stop here and I'm happy to take any questions. Yes, Clement.
Yes, Clement, thank you for the talk. It's very interesting, of course, quite short. So I'm just trying to think about so one example I know of the renovation of police stations in Rajasthan, for example. So at some point they all thought they had to look better and to follow some European certification. And so for that particular purpose, they asked money from local businessmen. So I'm just thinking, you're implicitly relating, the bribes that they're collecting potentially on every single person coming to them to ask for them to do something. I'm just thinking, especially as compared to informal taxation, where you think the incidence of this taxation mostly lies, and whether you have any evidence of that.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So that's something that we think about in the model, which is that the politician is interested in one specific group. So the model is broad enough that this could sort of cover anyone. But what we have in mind is that some people are going to be more or less affected by corruption, and also more or less likely to hold the government accountable for it. So in theory, this would be the prime target for the government. So groups that don't turn out very much in voting. So you can think of women turning out less than men, for example. If they also bear more of the cost of corruption, the incidence of these taxes are going to fall on them. So this is, this is what the model suggests. In our data, we don't, the women example, I mentioned it because we know that they're more likely to, in our context, to bear the cost of corruptions. But it sort of depends a little bit on where the corruption is coming from, right? So if it's coming from land permits and the more wealthy people need these land permits, then that's going to be a progressive tax in a way. But it depends a little bit more. So that's sort of what we're suggesting here, that and the specific context will matter. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that's very interesting.
Jonas, I think you're next.
Right. Yeah. So I was wondering, maybe I didn't understand everything, but so first the total value of the public good that is provided. So I was wondering first if you can allow for the fact that there's just kind of misplanning on the political side, and then bureaucrats are kind of just trying to fill the wedge of like there's some funds missing and they have to come up with them and they have to get creative. And I guess that's not really. And the second point is when you started out, I thought this was like an expectations kind of story, that kind of the government expects, like they know bureaucrats are kind of bribing, so they don't need to give them that much. And bureaucrats are kind of bribing because they get not enough money. And so it seems like this vicious cycle, which like there seems to be like, maybe there's kind of a policy to kind of get away from this equilibrium. But in the model, at least this one, I didn't see coming up in the model anymore.
Yeah, the two very good points. Yeah, so I mean, they're sort of related, I guess, in a way, right? So because there could be a funding gap because you don't know that the service is more expensive than the money you've given. But in the long run, dynamically, we would expect that, well, you see that the funding gap was plugged by the bureaucrats. So next time you're going to continue to give less money and you have less incentives to do that. So that's what we have in mind. Now, you're right that the model is not dynamic, so it doesn't take that into account explicitly, but it's still you know, a game theoretical model. So it's an equilibrium that the politician anticipates what the bureaucrat is going to do with the money, and this is, you know, the bureaucrat doesn't do it because of the incentives that have been designed by the politician when choosing the fiscal policy. So it's still this idea that it's an equilibrium. So both aspects are going to work together, and this is why we can get these two possible equilibria depending on whether we get the formal fiscal policy or the informal one. I think Matthew, you were next.
Thanks. Really interesting interpretation of corruption. It seems like the types of public goods that fit into the second category are almost like club goods, where there's some notion of excludability. So I'm curious if in your model, what's the benefit to the government of keeping these goods being publicly provided instead of fully privatizing them?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it sort of relates to the incidence question from earlier in a way as well, because it's who would be willing to pay for these goods in if they weren't provided by the bureaucrats. So yeah, there's a sense in which some of them could be privatized, I guess, and one way we think about that is that an alternative interpretation of the model is to think of this as user fees. So I pay a bribe, for example, in the first case of Petrol, I pay a bribe for the police to have access to petrol, and in exchange they're going to protect me, which is a little bit similar to these stories about the mafia providing public services as well. But this is a slightly different interpretation, and the model doesn't exclude either. So this is why we think that this approach is broad enough to cover both the case of the police station, where you can have this sort of user fee interpretation, and the second case where you said some of these goods are going to be more or less excludable. So some of them, again, could be seen as an instance of user fees. Some of them are going to be more of a redistributive aspect to it. So we charge bribes on some part of the population, for example, the ones that need land permit, and we use that money to bribe free food to those who don't have land and don't need that. So I don't know if that answers exactly what you had in mind, but this is how we think about it. Any other questions?
Great, thanks so much, Clement. Thank you, everyone. Next session's at 20 past. So if you want to go back to the main room or have a short little break, now's the time. Thanks again so much, Clement.
Thanks.